is going to continue talking about the symmetrical balance design. Now, in the last video, I talked about how to measure things out and keep everything symmetrical and draw out those details. But now I want to talk about a very important aspect of this drawing, which is contrast. Because your design is non-representational, there is an importance that is going to be placed on showing lots of contrast in order to keep things interesting. And the easiest way to do that is through line contrast. So that's what I want to talk about specifically, is how to use different contrasting types of lines to, again, keep your design interesting and have lots of variety. So what you don't want to do with your design is to draw all of your lines as just single pencil or Sharpie marker lines within the composition. Instead, you want a variety of different types of lines. So you want thicker lines and thinner lines, and curving, flowing lines, zigzagging lines, lines that change direction and go in various patterns in order to keep them interesting. But the biggest thing you can do is just vary up the thickness of your lines. So, for example, if I start out with a line that looks like this, it's pretty thin and it doesn't really stand out that much. So all I have to do, though, if I want to thicken this line up, is draw it more as a shape than a line. So what I'm going to be really making is a very long, thin rectangle, which ends up looking basically like a long, thicker line. And you can do this with a variety of different lines in order to have a variety of different thicknesses with your lines, so that some lines are thinner and some lines are thicker. And the idea is when I would switch to Sharpie, these lines would be filled in, so they'll be solid black, and that's going to really give these thicker lines some added weight. And that added weight is going to create additional emphasis on those places and really draw attention. So the thicker the lines, the bolder the marks are, the more easy it's going to stand out. And you can also have variable thickness lines. So for example, this curve line that I created earlier, if I want to create a variable thickness line, well, I can make a shape that gets thinner in some places and thicker in others, and changes and varies as it goes across the course of the line. This is another excellent way to get some contrast with the lines that you put down. Another thing that you can consider when drawing a line is, if you start out with just a simple pencil line like this, when you switch to using your Sharpie marker, you can change up that line by adding in a different type of line. So for example, instead of a solid continuous line, I can make a broken line, like a dotted line. And I started out with a solid pencil line so that it stays in one continuous direction, but I'm varying it up by adding in some dashed lines. And the good thing is, after I do that, if I do the dashes with my Sharpie marker, then I can go in and erase the original pencil marks and be left with a broken line. And there's plenty of different ways you can do it. It's not just a dashed line. You can do patterns and things. So I could do something like this. I could do some kind of alternating design with my line, so going from circles to triangles to circles to triangles, or any number of variations that you can think of to just give your line details a little bit more interest. So there's all kinds of little patterns and things that you can do just to make sure that every line that you put down is just more interesting than just a single, simple, flat line like that. And so, again, when it comes to these thicker lines here, the idea is when you do work with the Sharpie marker that your goal will be, and by the way, you can freehand it, but you sometimes will get better results if you get that ruler back out again like this. And it's also a little faster too. If you've got some stability with the ruler added, you can get a nice straight line. So if you do everything nice and neat with your pencil and your ruler to begin with, you don't want to lose that neatness by freehanding everything unless you've got a really stable hand. So I'm going to go ahead and outline this with the ultra fine point Sharpie. And this is another important point. Any line work that you do and everything that you go back over from pencil to Sharpie should be done with the ultra fine point Sharpie. This is the one with the very small tip. You're not going to use the fine point for doing your line work. And the reason why is because the fine point Sharpie tends to bleed a little bit. And so when you put a mark down, the ink tends to kind of spread out further into the space. And it makes your lines tend to look a little bit fuzzy. Instead, what you want to use the fine point for is for a line like this, a thicker line. After you've outlined it with the ultra fine, then you can go in and fill it in with the fine point. And that'll make this process a little faster, because if you try to fill everything in with the ultra fine, then it's just going to take a little bit longer, and it'll also use up a lot of your ink, and you want to preserve the ink in those ultra fine pens as much as possible, because we'll be using them quite a bit. So like I said, when you're filling shapes in solid, then switch over to the fine point, and it'll make that process a little bit faster and easier. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that you can definitely go overboard with making a line too thick, and it can stop looking like a line if you get to that point. So if I were to take, and I'm just going to flip this over on the back to illustrate this, if you draw a line that looks like this, okay, and of course you fill that in with Sharpie and everything. This was all solid black Sharpie. This is a very dominating design. This line, for once, it's so thick too, it doesn't really look like a line. It looks like a rectangle because it's just too wide going this way. But if I were to fill this all in with solid Sharpie marker, the thicker the lines are, the more visual weight they carry. And visual weight is just that idea of things that attract attention within your design. The more visual weight it has, the more attention it attracts. And so if you make something like this, it's going to have so much visual weight that it'll be very difficult to balance out the rest of your composition, because it's just going to attract so much attention and be so dominant within the space. So you don't want really big areas filled in with solid Sharpie. You want your design to have lots of variety, and this just takes up too much space within the design. So don't do anything like that. But the other thing to consider is if you're trying to balance out your composition with thicker lines, you want them to be spread out throughout the composition. Because if you only have this one thick line and all the rest of your lines are thin throughout the design, then this is going to carry more visual weight than anything else, and it can, again, create an imbalance because your attention is going to this. But if I then make, say, this one thicker, well, suddenly it's going to pull some visual weight up here. And if I fill this one in, that'll pull some attention back down from there. So I want a variety of thicker and thinner lines throughout the design to draw attention to all areas of the composition. So if you put all the thick stuff in the center, you won't have any attention to the outside edges. If you put them all near the outside, then you won't have any attention in the middle. So make sure as you're adding in different types of lines in your composition that you make an effort to distribute them throughout and constantly be mixing up that variety so that they're not all concentrated in one area within the design. If you can do that, it's going to make your designs much more interesting and more successful. So please keep that in mind as well as you proceed. Thanks, and have a great day.